Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Steve Johnson, and I want to welcome you to this first episode in a series that I've entitled the REBT Masterclass series. In this episode, I'm going to be covering the foundations of the REBT model, and then for the other 5 subsequent sessions or episodes on Saturdays, this time, consecutive Saturdays, I will be going more in depth on the model and its application. Okay, so let me get busy here. But before I launch into the webinar, if you have any questions that you would like to ask or comments, things that you would like for me to cover, just make make a comment in the comments section, and I will get to those as I can. Okay, so let me move into our PowerPoint. I want to begin with the general agenda for today. I want to look at the evolutionary origin of mental and emotional disturbance. For those of you who are not real fond of that evolutionary model, you can just see it as the way humans have developed over time, with particular kinds of features that I will be considering in this webinar. Then I will shift over to look very briefly at the origin of REBT, specifically Stoic philosophy, the Stoic philosophy of Epictetus. And then I'm going to jump into REBT's ABCD model. And I'm updating that with information from neuropsychology. So let me get started, beginning to look at this evolutionary origin of mental and emotional disturbance in general. Why? Because every model of psychotherapy has individuals coming in to talk about challenging issues. Now, they don't come in because they're happy and everything's going well. So we're going to be looking at maybe common or normal kinds of mental and emotional states, but they are disturbing to the client, and the client wants to do something to overcome them. So let's look at this, and that is to go to brain function. That's one thing that we all share, and that's the brain, and all our brains, when they're functioning well, function in very fundamental and predictable ways. The primary function of our brain is survival. It's not to determine what truth is. It's not to determine, it's not even to make us happy. It is really so that we survive, and that's been the function of the brain for eons. And so to survive, there are 2 primary survival tasks. These are things that have kept us alive, that are necessary for us to live. One is that we must be able to perceive threat as best we can. We're not always great at that, but one mechanism that we have is the perception of threat in the environment. The second one is to perceive resources. Threats would be those things that could harm us. Resources are those things such as food and water and shelter, clothing if we need that, depending on the environment. All of those things are resources, and we will talk about the major resource that we have developed as humans over time. But the primary function of the brain is survival. So everything that we're talking about after this is related to how and what the brain does, so that we maximize the possibility of surviving, and that those individuals who are connected to us survive. So let's begin by looking at that one primary brain function, which is to perceive threat. And as I said, the brain's function is primarily to perceive threat rather than to discern truth or even to discern reality as it is. We don't know whether we perceive reality as it is. And of course, we know that we don't always perceive reality as it is anyway. And how do we know that we ever perceive reality as it is? But rather than getting off on that philosophical issue, um, whatever we perceive, if it helps us to perceive threat, that will keep us alive. Okay. And because we need to perceive threat and make an accurate assessment of threat very quickly sometimes, the brain does not have time to focus on all the details within that or associated with that environmental threat. So it will see patterns. The brain is a pattern perceiving organ, and that's very, very important. The result, though, is because it needs to act quickly and make a good judgment, because could be life or death. The result is that the brain actually makes errors, fundamental errors in perception. And its bias, the errors are biased towards experiencing threat when there is no threat. But the brain doesn't really care whether it perceives something as a threat that isn't threat. Why? Because if it perceives a threat, we're alive, right? Especially if it is a threat. But what if it perceives something that isn't really a threat as a threat? Well, all that we have done is experience needless anxiety or needless fear. But the brain doesn't care because we're still alive. So even if it makes an error in perceiving something as a threat that isn't a threat, we're alive. So the brain moves forward. However, the focus is on survival, and that's important, not our happiness, not being free from anxiety or fear. And because of the rapidity with which the brain has to make those assessments of threat or non-threat or a resource, then the brain makes errors. Well, because the brain makes errors and it consistently makes errors, and we will see the brain makes more errors now in modern culture than it ever has. This sets the stage for all humans to develop mental, emotional distress, and some go on to develop mental and emotional disorders. So when the brain actually perceives something and assesses that as a threat, what happens in the body is very predictable. There's what we call this cascade progression of defenses or cascade progression of actions and reactions by the body. And Pavlov noted that when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, that is what happens when when the brain perceives a threat. Initially, we are frozen. We don't take any action. He called that stoeta, and which literally means, what is this? And so that's kind of what the brain is doing. What is this? Is this really a threat? Or is this a resource or a non-threat or a combination of threat and resource, right? So it stops, it freezes, it tries to assess it and evaluate it. Why? So it can take action. After that, with the sympathetic activation, and we call this part the uproar, which dominates in PTSD, what happens is we kick into a mode that we learned early as children when we were in biology, the fight and flight responses. So we perceive the threat and we have to make an assessment whether we could take on that threat, or if we're big and we can take it on, we think we have the capability of doing it, then we might fight. But, and some of this is species determined, if we cannot take on a overwhelming threat or perceived large threat, then we may engage in flight or try to get away from that which we perceive as a threat. When that happens, the body gets ready to act. And so it produces a chemical called cortisol. And some people call cortisol the stress kind of hormone. I rather perceive it as the threat hormone rather than stress. Although typically the things that we experience as stressful, we perceive as some kind of threat in some way. Well, as the sympathetic nervous system is activated and it keeps going up and up and up, and cortisol is produced, at the peak, we see dissociation. When dissociation occurs, then we kind of notice that the pain perception decreases, because we don't want to experience overwhelming pain if we're in the middle of fighting off the threat. So pain perception decreases, and even cognition goes down. We're in fight mode. We may not be able to do calculus or, remember how semicolon is used. The cognition that we have is limited to just survival. And still, if we have this, it continues to go up and activated the sympathetic nervous system, then we engage in fright. Fright must be there for someone to develop PTSD, for example. And so that is when we are engaged in that fright or experiencing that fright, we call that unresponsive immobility. It's short-lived, but we're kind of frozen. We don't take much action at that point. Dissociation, when we may even feel separated from our body. Well, when that peaks and the parasympathetic nervous system becomes activated, then we call that shutdown, where there's that phase of that even with a PTSD, which we call the shutdown PTSD. With that onset, then we experience flag, which is slow onset, and termination, which has a really extreme, in the extreme responses, results in actually fainting. So when the body is activated and the sympathetic nervous system is activated, our heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, we're highly ready to take something on. And when parasympathetic comes in, heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down. And so if that happens very, very quickly, some individuals, when there is the perception of threat, actually faint. So these would be the normal cascade defenses that we see when the brain perceives threat. And remember, cortisol is produced. Now, once that happens, there are several body systems that are activated, and this is tremendously important for us as we move into subsequent episodes, when we look at particular conditions and even how we would use REBT to treat those conditions. But one system we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal gland. The adrenals are where that cortisol is produced. What we typically see in literature is the stress hormone. And as I said, I rather, at a more general, deeper level, would love that we would call that the threat hormone. And so cortisol is produced. That cortisol is good in the short run. It is very good. It activates us to take on the threat and try to survive. And then there's another system with the amygdala, and sympathetic nervous system is involved there, where it really begins to direct the flow. So the blood is directed toward the striated muscles, which we need to actually run or to take something on, run or fight. So that is a really important one. So when the amygdala is activated, we see greater awareness and the mobilization of our defense responses that we have. Both of those systems, the HPA axis and the amygdala, adrenal gland, sympathetic nervous system, have been studied in great depth. But then there's a third system that happens, and this becomes really, really important as we look at all of this and our response to the perception of threat and what we will be doing in REBT. The third system is what we call the vasopressin oxytocin peptides. I'm going to go into that a little bit. I'm not going into that in great depth. In my course that I teach on trauma and addictions at the university, I would go spend maybe a session going into one class session going into that in greater detail. But this is the least studied system that gets activated with the perception of threat. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Not going to go into great depth, but you'll see why I'm coming back to it. And then the fourth system, which is tremendously important for us as humans, and why when we perceive threat and high levels of threat over a longer period of time, it is obligatory. It's really, really important for us to take action as psychotherapists, mental health professionals, because of the deleterious effects of that elevation of cortisol over a long period of time. Now, that system that I'm going to be talking about here is the immune system, which we heard through COVID was tremendously important, and it was highly relevant when we perceived the threat of COVID, and our body went through all of these, responses, physiological responses that set the stage for us to even acquire COVID. So in the short run, initially with the activation of the HPA axis, that creates, when there's a short-term stressor, when we're just experiencing the stressor, that's an upregulation of the immune response. That means it's the stress protective kind of effect of helpful social interaction when we have those stressors. However, and if it's just a short-term stressor and then the parasympathetic activation system kicks in, nervous system, and we don't have ongoing experiences of high levels of stress, then that's fine. That's fine. It's adaptive and helpful. But with chronic stressors, where cortisol is elevated over the long haul, that results in the suppression of the immune system, which leads to clinical disorders. Those can be medical disorders or psychological, mental, and emotional disorders. Medically, the suppression of the immune system leads to cardiovascular problems, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, and damage to a number of the organs of the body, and then also it can lead to elevation of anxiety, depression, and contribute to autoimmune diseases such as diabetes. High levels of stress over a long period of time cause inflammation, and elevated inflammation can contribute to the development of diabetes. So you can see this is really, really important that we notice this and we use some methods, and I'm going to be talking about REBT, so that we reduce the stress, we reduce the cortisol, and as quickly and as efficiently as we can. Now, some of my students will say, why don't we just try to make sure that the sympathetic nervous system isn't activated and we won't go through this? Well, that's not a viable option, because if the sympathetic nervous system is not activated, then we will not perceive the threat. And it is important for us to perceive threat. That's what keeps us alive, that and the perception of resources. So that's not a really good response. What we would like to happen is that we lower the amplitude of that sympathetic activation and the parasympathetic activation, so that we recover more quickly and more efficiently, and we have means to do that. And psychotherapies can help with that, and REBT will do that. And again, I said I will be looking at particular conditions and how we use particular interventions to do that. Today, I won't have time to get into all of that, because this is just an introduction to the model, and this is important because it's basic to whatever we do in any psychotherapy. Now, I want to go back. Remember, I talked about the oxytocin vasopressin peptide. When the brain does perceive threat, oxytocin, remember, gets activated. I haven't talked about oxytocin yet, but it gets activated, and it activates the vasopressin receptor when it perceives threat, which causes what? Anxiety and fear. And then that vasopressin causes additional anxiety. But here's where is something that really is important because we see this in all kinds of disorders. That is social avoidance. We see that in depression. We may see that in anxiety. We see that in PTSD. We may see that in eating disorders. We may see that in gambling or workaholism or behavioral addictions. So this is really important. Social avoidance, defensiveness, that kind of defensive behavior that is grounded in anger, etc., can be disruptive of relationships. Aggression, the same, and fear and freezing whenever we encounter something that we perceive as threat. However, when the brain perceives resources, oxytocin activates these oxytocin receptors, not the vasopressin receptors, which does something that's really important. And this is key because this is what I have been working on and what we try to develop interventions within REBT to make this happen in multiple different ways, okay? When oxytocin activates the oxytocin receptors, and what we see are high levels of social engagement. Instead of disrupting relationships, we move together in relationships. It enforces social bonds. That helps us do what? Helps us to deal with the threat. If we connect with each other, that's the biggest resource that we have to handle threat. Not disruption, not alienation, but social engagement, social bonds, and that is rewarding to us as humans, that connecting with other people is something that we like to do. So I hope this is clear. I know I had to do a quick and dirty kind of gloss over that, and we will come back to that, particularly when we look at anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder in upcoming weeks. So, but I want to look at what is setting the stage now, because we can't treat people centuries ago; they're gone. But we have people that are presenting to us now. They have the same brains that we've always had. Centuries ago, though, most humans experienced like real threats. And for protection, what do? We form tribes with connections to others. And that was the primary resource to face those threats and lower the threat to increase our survival. Animals do that. Humans have done that for eons. And even social media is doing what? To try to create connections. It doesn't always do a good job, and connecting face to face has far more rewards than connecting on Facebook or TikTok, which apparently will be gone, but we will see. The brain, though, has evolved very, very slowly. It's developed very, very slowly, but the culture in which we live has evolved very quickly, and now it's very, very fast. I'm fascinated with AI and using that in research. And it's so hard to keep on top of this because the culture is moving so quickly and scientifically and technologically. Well, so we have a brain that is slowly evolved. We have a culture that is quickly evolved. And so now this brain, this ancient brain that we have, is experiencing more novel events, more ambiguous events, more events and situations that are going to be perceived as threats, when in fact, many of those will not be perceived as threats. And if you are in a professional mental health individual or a grad student looking to get some, maybe a master's level, degree or doctoral level, you want to go into some form of psychotherapy or research, then you will know that we see threats that are not threats. In the DSM, there are disorders like social phobia. Social phobia is seeing something in the environment that actually is not a threat, but we take it as a threat. Or let's say we get a low FICO score, which is our credit score. We treat that, the brain will perceive that as a threat, just as if something is attacking us. It doesn't distinguish that. It just perceives something as a threat or non-threat. And so obviously the FICO score is not going to be seen as a resource, but it will be perceived as a threat and will react in the same cascade progression that we just went through. So we're going to have many more of those situations that we have not had previous experiences with. And so we're going to be physiologically aroused more often and perceive more threat in our environment than we ever have historically. So cortisol levels will be higher and for longer periods of time, contributing to more clinical conditions, including mental and emotional disorders. So it's going to be really important that we have therapies that recognize this and have interventions that will help us lower the cortisol. And we already know if we produce oxytocin, and I want to make it really clear, oxytocin knocks out the effect of cortisol. So that it's a lifesaver. So at UCLA, there was some research and they found that it's instead of just having fight and flight, which is really important, we need that to stay alive. One adaptation of this is what we call tend and befriend. And often females tend to be better at that than males, not always. But tending and befriending is doing what? Making connections. Sometimes fighting and flight can be disruptive of connections. Sometimes that's necessary, right? But tending and befriending will help us recover from those elevated cortisol levels over a period of time. And so that is wonderful when we can have therapies that help individuals make connections, especially for individuals who have experienced perceived a good number of threats in their life. Whether they were real threats or they just believed that they were threats makes no difference because the body responds in the same way to both types. I hope that's really, really clear. So let me move on. Remember, I said the second thing on the agenda was where did REBT come from? What was the kind of philosophical basis of REBT? Well, REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, is the first of these second wave behavioral models that was developed. The first wave is just behavioral theory, stimulus response. And that's really good for treating many, many different issues in life. But it has its drawbacks because it ignores one thing. We realize that between stimulus and response, which focused only on behavior, not emotional responses or anything else. We realize that between the stimulus and the response, there is the human body, there is the person. And so in that human body, we see the second wave became curious. This is REBT and CBT. REBT developed by Albert Ellis, CBT by Aaron Beck. And REBT came first, and then, of course, CBT. And Albert Ellis, while he was working with a client one time, had a reaction, and she said that, that essentially that Albert Ellis was triggering her because he reminded her of her father. And then Al said, do I look like your father? No. Do you think I'm your father? No. And so she goes, oh, I get what you're saying. It's not, it's not you that's causing my anxiety. It is what I'm thinking about you. And he says, that's absolutely it. And Albert read Epictetus's work. Epictetus was a wonderful Stoic philosopher. He was a slave who was tortured, and he developed this approach toward life that helped him. And now it was incorporated into REBT by Albert Ellis because he had read the Enchiridion, where in that Epictetus said that events and situations do not cause our emotions or our behaviors, but he said emotions. Events and situations do not cause our emotions. But those emotions are caused by the thoughts we have about those situations. Now, the situations are relevant, but the thoughts that we have about those situations are the direct cause, not the distant cause, but the direct cause of the emotions that we have. So that insight that happened hundreds of years ago and was revived by Albert Ellis became the philosophy underlying rational emotive behavioral therapy, the first of the second wave behavioral models. Okay, so let's get into that model. And I want to look at REBT's ABC model. This is crucial. If you don't understand the ABC model, you don't understand REBT. And Al liked using easily remembered kind of mnemonics. And so A, B, C, and then whatever he said about each of those, he used the first letter to correspond to the A, B, and C. The A is what we call the activating event, or sometimes we call it the adversity. But actually, we look at not just the activating event. That means what happened. We look at the critical activating event. What part of what happened was most relevant to the emotions and behaviors and even the physiological responses. So we want to know what the general event was. But then we want to know the critical activating event. What part of that activating event? Now, I'll give you an example. Let's say that I just got fired from my job and I'm feeling angry. That's my emotion. And I go to see a REBT counselor because I want to overcome that anger. And so we say, well, what happened? What was it? We're asking about the active event. And you go, I just got fired. Well, that's the activating event, but it may not be the critical activating event. It's not just everything about getting fired, but it may be some particular things about getting fired. And so if the REBT therapist is, a really good REBT therapist, they'll say, what part of getting fired is most relevant to anger? What part of that did you get angry about? And they would say, you know what it was? My boss pulled me in at the end of the day, and with a big smile on his face, he handed me the pink slip and told me I was fired that day and take my stuff home. And so what part of it? The individual might say, it was that smile on his face. It was that smile on his face. And I can't believe that anybody would do that. So that's the critical activating event. The activating event is getting fired. But the critical part of that was that snicker, that snide smile on the boss's face when he fired him. Now, the beliefs, the B beliefs, and we're going to see that there are two types here. But beliefs would be the thoughts, basic attitude, inferences, or beliefs that an individual has about that critical activating event. So the boss fires him. He's snidely smiling, and our client must have had some kind of thought. Otherwise, they wouldn't be angry. And so we would be very curious about that. But before we went to the beliefs, we would say, okay, we got the critical activating event. Now, after getting the A, we need to get the C, or the consequences, which would be the emotions and behaviors. And so we might say, well, what emotion, when you got that pink slip and he was smiling at you, what emotion did you have? Angry. I was really PO'd. I was really angry with him. So we got the A, we got the C. And then we could even say with the C, on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 is the most angry you've ever been, and 0 is you're asleep and not angry, what was it? And if he goes, it was an 11. So we know he's really, really enraged. And so then we would say, and what were you thinking, or what were you telling yourself about him smiling when he handed you that pink slip that had you experience that anger at that level? And he might say something like, I said, he is nothing but a jerk. He's a horrible human being, and I can't stand him. Okay, so those would be the beliefs. He's horrible, and I can't stand him. So those would be two different beliefs that we have. So we got the A, critical A, we got the beliefs, and we got the C. Now, let me just say, we will look at that probably in more depth at another time. But when a client comes in, often they will, what would you like to talk about? What would then they might start off with a situation. I got fired. Or they might start off with an emotion. I am so angry. So if they say I got fired, right? Then we would say, we would get the critical A there. And then we would go, and what emotion did you have when that happened? Then we get the C, or what behavior did you exhibit? And then, or if they come in and they say, I was extremely angry, they would go, about what? So we're asking about we're asking about the activating event. And then we got to get a critical activating event out of it. And then we start with an A or we start with the C. If we get the A first, then we get the C, and then we get the B. We start with the C first, then we go to the A, and then we get the B. B is the third thing that we get, the last thing that we get there. And so that's the thought that is actually directly contributing to the potentially dysfunctional emotion or even physiological responses. Now, let's go into that belief. There are two different, and these are actually, it shouldn't be called belief, it should be called cognition. But Al wanted a B in there, right? So for the ABC. So he used the word belief. But really, it's a cognition. And there are two kinds of cognitions: inferences and beliefs. Inferences are cognitions or thoughts that attribute meaning to a situation. The situation means this, right? And is the most basic inference is perceiving something as a threat. The meaning of that situation is what? This is a threat. This is a threat. We're going to see other inferences, but all of them boil down to some degree of being a threat of some sort. But with different emotions, we're going to see additional inferences there, okay? So this is going to be really helpful. And we'll learn conceptualization of emotion later that does just what I just mentioned. The other cognition is beliefs. Beliefs don't attribute meaning to a situation. They evaluate it. They evaluate it as good or bad, helpful, unhelpful, horrible, or whatever, right? So they're evaluating, not giving meaning to it. So we have one kind of cognition that attributes meaning. We have another kind of cognition that establishes the value, or actually infers the value there. Okay. Now, I want to put this all together. It won't be comprehensive. We will get to that in the next lecture. So I want to look at inferences, emotions, and behaviors, right? Inferences, emotions, and behaviors. I'm not putting the belief in on this one. I'll do that on another slide. But the inferences, while they're generally about a threat, they're slightly different for each of the different emotions. Okay, so let's look at that. And what we know about from the conceptualization of emotion and lots of research is that every emotion has some very particular behaviors or even action potentials associated with it. Believe me, this is so important if you're a counselor, psychotherapist. If you know this, then you will be able to help work with the client, collaborate with the client to develop interventions to change these behaviors. And especially when those behaviors are causing you even more problems in solidifying some mental or emotional issue. So let's just take a few of these common emotions, look at the threat, and look at the behavior associated with each. And by the end of the 6 weeks, you'll know all about this. So let's look at probably the most commonly experienced emotion, or at least one of them. Some people say anger is the most common, but anxiety. And so anxiety or concern. We would say anxiety is a dysfunctional one, and I'll give you reasons why a little bit later, and concern is a functional one. They're both, neither one feel good. But if you're experiencing anxiety or concern, either one, your inference of threat is what? There's a threat to me or my comfort. During COVID, we had both kinds of threats. If you remember, we thought COVID could actually kill us, it could make us really sick for a long time, and it disrupted our comfort. Remember how difficult it was to go to the grocery store and buy your favorite foods, etc., or even toilet paper for a while? So it was a threat to the ego, survival, and it was also a threat to our comfort. That's what anxiety is about. And the behavior that is associated with anxiety is avoidance. When we tend to be anxious about something, we try to avoid it. Now, concern is different. Remember, I said concern is the functional equivalent or corollary to anxiety. And there we don't avoid, we approach, which is a healthier response. Let's look at depression. And the depression in REBT would be the unhelpful expression. Well, again, we'll look at why we call it that. And then sadness, the more functional expression. They both share the same threat, the threat of what? Significant loss. Loss of what? Loss of life of a friend, loss of health, loss of a job, loss of meaning or purpose in life. It can be any loss whatsoever, as long as it's perceived as we make an attribution of significant loss. For depression, it's not so much avoidance, but we withdraw. We pull away from things that we normally did. We may isolate from friends who we usually enjoyed, being around. I know when I'm depressed, I withdraw from something that I do that brings me great joy, and that is to go to a movie, get a huge tub of popcorn with butter on it, and have a soda that's as big as the state that I live in. Okay, and so that's withdrawal. Why do we withdraw? Because of the threat of significant loss. Sadness is different. Instead of withdrawal, it does a healthier thing, and that is to approach the issue, take it on. Then guilt, and if you're taking notes, you would put guilt / remorse. So guilt we would see as the more dysfunctional emotion, remorse, the more functional one. And guilt is the inference there is the loss is that we have violated a moral or ethical principle that is important to us. So we experience that as guilt. If we have remorse, it starts with the same thing. We have violated an important moral ethical principle. Guilt, then, the action potential is self-punishment. Beat the self up in all kinds of different ways. Whereas with remorse, we don't waste our time beating the self up. We engage in self-acceptance. We may hold ourselves accountable for maybe the unethical or immoral thing that we did, but we don't rate the self and feel like we have to punish the self. And then the next emotion, and these are all I'm going to get to, although we could do this for all the emotions that generally show up in therapy, and that is rage. Rage versus righteous indignation or annoyance would be another one. And so with rage and with, righteous indignation or annoyance, there's the inference that someone else violated a principle that is important to me. They violated justice toward me. They violated compassion toward me. Any of those, we might be really right. They violated a promise that they made to me that was really important. Okay, so and then the action potential associated with it for rage, the dysfunctional corollary would be aggression, and that aggression could be physical or verbal or like slamming the door, as you walk out the room with some few choice words as you're leaving. Or if you are engaging have righteous indignation or you're really annoyed, then you may be assertive rather than act so aggressively. Aggression violates, is very disruptive of relationships, where assertiveness can actually help build healthier relationships. So here, this chart is to let you see the relationship among the inferences, and remember, inferences are those cognitions that attribute meaning to a situation or event, then how is that inference different for each of the different emotions, and what are the behaviors associated with that? So, very quick word, and I'm not going to belabor it because we will do this at another time, particularly when we take on anxiety disorders. If someone has anxiety and they perceive a threat to themselves or their comfort, and they're avoiding, there will be several kinds of ways that we can, interventions that we can develop. And one of those, as many of you know who have studied psychotherapy, would be, exposure. Instead of having them avoid it, we would have them move toward that. Because when you avoid, all that's going to do is cause the anxiety to go up, stay up, and over a longer period of time. And if you engage in avoidance, your world can become significantly smaller. Whereas if you move toward that, as you would with concern, then you've expanded your world and your capability of handling negative events and situations. Moving on. Now I want to look at the types of beliefs that we consider within REBT. Now, in old versions of REBT, they would call these beliefs irrational or rational. I don't use those terms anymore, and some of the REBT therapists don't use them either. I tend to say unhelpful or helpful, or more unhelpful and more unhelpful or more helpful kinds of beliefs. So when people come in, of course, we're going to try to zero in on the unhelpful ones because those are the ones that are tending to cause or major contributing causal factors to dysfunctional or very painful emotions and the behaviors that don't help them. And what do we mean by not helping them? We will cover a little later. The central irrational or unhelpful belief is what we call demandingness. In English, the words that go through our head and sometimes pop out of our mouth when we have a demanding belief are the shoulds, the oughts, the musts, the have tos, and the needs, or the should not, must not, all of those corollaries. Yeah. And the next one we would call catastrophizing or awfulizing. Catastrophizing is often used in CBT and awfulizing more in REBT, but it doesn't matter. It's really the meaning of these things, not the label we give them. It's the reality and not the illusion. So when we awfulize, we're saying, oh, this is terrible about the situation or event. This is terrible. This is horrible. This is awful. This is 100% as bad as it could be, right? Or this is an utter catastrophe. It's a huge failure, those kinds of things. The problem with this and why they're called irrational is they are escalating the threat rather than taking it on and seeing for what it is. The next area is what we call frustration and tolerance, which is, bottom line, is almost 100% there when we see an individual with anxiety. Frustration and tolerance is, this is too much. I can't stand this. This is overwhelming. So when people say they're overwhelmed, they are engaging in frustration and tolerance. Of course, it's utterly irrational. They say, I can't stand it. It's overwhelming, but they're right there. They haven't dropped dead. Nobody's had to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, right? They're there. They just feel really bad, but they're escalating, right? Escalating their ability to handle that frustration. And then the last one of the four, and I like that we only have four. CBT, they'll have maybe 12 or more of these beliefs. But in REBT, we just have four. And the fourth category is what we call global negative rating, particularly global negative rating of the self. I'm a loser. I'm a failure. I'm no good. I'm nothing but a sinner. I'm beyond redemption. Okay? I'm worthless. Others, I'm fine, but you're no good. That other person is no good. They're terrible. They're horrible. They're a loser, etc. Right? Or life. This is globally, right? Life is nothing but a veil of tears. It's horrible. It's meaningless. It's purposeless. When people start thinking about that, then we become very concerned as psychotherapists, right? We often will do a suicide assessment. So we really want to know these because these are going to give rise to the dysfunctional negative emotions. But then we have some helpful beliefs, and these are what we're going to try to do. If a client has an unhelpful or irrational belief, we're going to work with them to help them develop more rational beliefs that are more helpful to them. And we'll talk about, again, as I said several times now, helpful or unhelpful in what ways? Again, so instead of demanding this, what we'll want is preference. I wish, I want, I hope, I desire. If you are demanding that something be the way that you want it to be, you will be upset, perhaps very upset if it doesn't happen. But if you go, I hope, I wish, I want, then you may be disappointed, but it's not as overwhelming as demanding as it doesn't come through. So instead of catastrophizing or awfulizing, we just want to get them to just acknowledge the badness, but without exaggerating the badness. Not everything is the Holocaust. Failing a final exam is not going to cause a total loss of meaning and purpose and the death of Western civilization, right? But we act like that sometimes. Frustration intolerance, the equivalent there, helpful equivalent would be, again, acknowledge the badness, but realize that we can stand it and that we are standing it. We just don't like it. We don't like it. It's painful, but we can handle it. Okay. If you believe you can handle it, then you're going to do very poorly when that kind of a thought kicks in. You're not going to be very resilient at all. Instead of global negative rating of the self or others or life, we want unconditional acceptance of self, others, or life. Now, there's a lot of misnomers about that. A lot of people think unconditional acceptance means that we like it. No, we don't. We don't necessarily like it. We don't want it, but we accept it. Because if we don't accept it as it is, we will not do a very good job of even changing it. If you just emotionally react to it without acceptance, again, not like it, you can want to change it. You could. And so I hope that's helpful. Yeah, and let me take some questions here. We had a couple. What if it is many things? Right? Oh, I think this individual was talking about what if the critical activating event involves several things. Doesn't matter. Just acknowledge every one of those things that they're looking at. Fine. So those would be what we would try to help them change the beliefs about. Okay. Yeah, we would try to get whatever factors they put in there. Okay. So that's easy. And what would you address each of those? Well, we would just take them sequentially, right? Typically we would ask the client, which one would you like to look at first? So we don't make that decision. We let the client lead us on that. And then someone said, what about after the emotions, the physical actions? Sometimes the emotions will come first and then the behaviors come second. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes behaviors come and then the emotions. What we know in REBT, and we've learned this through all kinds of research, is that emotions, behaviors, and cognitions are interconnected. And this is really, really helpful for us. If we are aware of one, then we can help become aware of the other ones. Or if we work on one, then we can work on the others. I always give it this kind of example. I love this question. A lot of people think that we have to go after the belief and change it, and that changing the belief will be the only way that we change the behavior or the emotion. Not necessarily. My wife, who was the chair of a biochemistry department at engineering university, would often come home and say, Steve, we've just been invited to an engineering party. Well, when I heard engineering party, then that didn't click for me. I would not think of going to that party as a real party. Okay. So I would say things like, I think I'm sick that day. And Carol would say, I didn't even tell you what day it is. I go, yeah, but I know I'm going to be sick. And, but um, she would say, you're going, we support each other. It's like, okay. So I would go, I'm thinking this is going to be horrible. This is going to be boring. This is going to be a waste of my time, etc. But I went. And because I thought, oh, this is going to be boring. They're going to be talking about inclined planes and engineering kinds of stuff. And a Turkish engineer came up to me and goes, oh, I hear you're a psychologist. I've been struggling with depression for a long time. Well, usually I don't like it when I'm hit up at a party to try to, for someone to get free psychotherapy. But I went, oh my God. You know what I mean? So we started talking and I had a real enjoyable time with him. And then some others around heard the conversation and they joined in. And we talked about some engineering stuff, but we also talked about emotions and some real vulnerability. And what happened? My belief didn't change until my action changed. When what I was trying to do was avoid, but when I acted into the world rather than to avoid, then my beliefs changed. I quit believing that this would be horrible. I quit believing that this is an utter waste of my time. So sometimes, we go with whatever. For some clients, changing the belief is going to be easier. So go with that. For some, it is going to kind of changing the behavior. And frankly, research shows over and over again that sometimes with people who are depressed, who have withdrawn, the best thing is to start with the behavior, move them towards something. And then we get a better change in the emotion, a quicker change in the emotion. But we don't know until we try. And so we can't a priori know what client's going to do, but we have these skills and we can try different things because all of these psychophenomena are connected. And someone said, are people born more of one way than, I don't know what you mean, born more one way or another. I don't know particularly what you're talking about there. Does this mean, do people tend to have a propensity toward anxiety? Yeah, people can have a genetic loading for any of these things, okay? And so when they come in, they're going to be more likely to experience more anxiety. I often joke with my clients when they first came in, I said, you know what? It is very important that you choose the right parents. Don't make a mistake on that. And they go, what do you mean? And then we laugh. I went, yeah, because genetically, if you're related and you're going to inherit some of their strengths, you may inherit some of their propensities. It's not going to determine that you're going to have an anxiety disorder, but if you have that propensity, the genetic propensity, and you happen to exist in an environment where that gets activated, then you may have more common experiences of anxiety or any other of the emotions. So if that's what you're meaning, then fine. And then the person said, or what about, are more people, for example, are some people leaning more toward irrational beliefs than rational beliefs? Well, in general, humans lean more toward irrationality than rationality, okay? That's because of that brain culture mismatch early on, and because we will have a greater propensity to perceive threats that are no threats, okay? And we will argue that they're a threat. So yes, just as humans are highly disturbable creatures. Are some people more predisposed to some? Yeah, we do know that there are differences between babies, not in huge or not in real discrete ways that many people think there is, but even newborns there can be fussy babies or easygoing babies, and we find that fussy babies tend to have a propensity toward being disturbed, more easily aroused, more disturbed, and the other babies more laid back. So that can be our predisposition, right? So there are pros and cons to both. There can be people who tend to be more optimistic, and there are people who tend to be more pessimistic. People who are more pessimistic tend to hold more of these unhelpful, irrational beliefs, and people who are optimistic, more rational or helpful. However, being optimistic about a really negative thing that if we don't take action could cause harm to another person is utter irrationality. Let me give an example. Let's say I have a child who has a 104-degree fever. Now, let's say that the person is highly anxious. That's not helpful. If you're highly anxious and you're just so focused on the anxiety, when the cortisol levels are up, remember it suppresses cognition. And when the problem-solving behavior is suppressed, they may not take the proper steps to try to get that fever down. Call the doctor, put them, in a little bit cooler water, whatever, or compresses, whatever it is, I can't prescribe for that, but if you have concern, which is a more helpful negative emotion, then you can think more clearly and take action. But what if the person's happy? What if the parent is happy? Then that is an emotion. Happiness is emotion we call a positive emotion. We like to experience it, but it is highly unadaptive. It's maladaptive in that kind of situation. So positive emotions and being optimistic, it can be helpful or unhelpful depending on the context. So we always have to be aware of the context. So thank you very much for the person who answered that question. Really, really quite helpful. And any more? I mean, they've all been excellent questions. I'm really happy about that. Now, I want to look at how do we distinguish helpful from unhelpful beliefs. Now, this is really, 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 really important. What we do is when a person tells us what they believe, we actually look at the belief and we ask the client, when you hold that belief, does that help you reach your desired life goals, whether they're short-term or long-term? Do they on the average, tend to help you or not help you? And in this particular case, was holding that belief helpful or unhelpful? If it's unhelpful, that belief is irrational, okay? Or unhelpful. So it depends on whether an emotion or a belief is helpful or unhelpful, is whether that belief or that emotion helps the individual attain their desired life goals or not. Now let me cover the next one, and then I want to go back to this. An unhelpful belief is one that gets in the way. It impedes or actually stops, inhibits an individual in attaining their desired life goals. Again, whether those are short-term or long-term, okay? Those are very important. Now, and you've always got to ask that. Here's where most therapists, and it doesn't have to be just new therapists, right? The new therapists are wonderful. Sometimes they just have wonderful skills when counseling. That God just gave them. They chose the right parents, etc. But sometimes we say, oh, that emotion is normal in that situation. So they would say that if the situation is highly negative, then we should probably have a highly negative emotion and that's normal. We don't approach it that way in this model. All kinds of emotions are normal, but they may not be helpful. And we zero in on whether they're helpful. Let's say you're highly anxious and it's normal statistically for you to be anxious. What are you going to get out of that? What you're going to get out of that is anxiety, and the behavior you're going to get out of that is avoidance. Your world gets smaller and you don't deal functionally with the situation as well as you could, right? So it's not we don't focus so much on normalcy as we do helpfulness, right? And so if some of my clients go, well, isn't that normal? I go, yeah, absolutely normal, but is it helpful, right? Because what we want is a helpful emotion so that you do a better job of attaining your desired life goals. And for most of us as humans, one of our desired life goals is connecting with other people or doing better at school or doing better at work or experiencing more happiness. You see? So that's why we focus more on, is it helping you reach your goal rather than it is normal. And you can really do harm to a client if they're very anxious, you go, oh, well, that's normal given what you're going through. I never say that to a client. I would never say that. What I might say is, first of all, I don't call it validating the emotion. What I say is, let's validate where you are right now. What you're experiencing is totally human. This does not make you emotionally have a mental or emotional disorder. Let's acknowledge that. But let's move beyond that, right? Let's just move beyond that to whether it's helpful. So when people say, I need my emotion validated, well, the way that most people talk about it, I would just say is just downright wrong. But if you mean that you go, you know what? It makes sense that you're going through that. But would you like to continue to be having that emotion? Or would you like to have another one about this? And if they go, well, I liked it, then I'll go, okay, well, then just hold on to that. Okay. But otherwise, then let's change it so that you can do a better job of attaining your desired life goals and have these wonderful, meaningful connections with other people. Make sense? I hope so. So if I didn't explain that very well, just feel free to reach out again. Now, let me talk a little bit more about emotions. I'll get out of here on time so that you can, do whatever you want to do. I'm having a craving for a Big Mac, but I don't think my wife's going to let me do it. So I might as well talk about emotions. We talk about positive emotions and negative emotions. Positive emotions are just emotions that we like to feel, happiness, contentment, those kinds of things. Negative emotions just don't feel good. We don't desire them. But we cannot assume that positive emotions are helpful emotions and negative emotions are unhelpful emotions. If you think that, you're going to not help the client a lot. So helpful emotions, we've already said it, they help support an individual in reaching their desired life goals. Again, short-term or long-term. And by the way, when we counsel, we want to make sure that we have long-term goals identified for the client. Collaboratively, we work on it with them. We don't tell them what they should be. And then short-term goals that they have to help reach the long-term goals. We need a combination. If you have one without the other, that can cause some problems. And another time for that, unless somebody has a question about it. So helpful emotions support you at reaching your desired life goals, and unhelpful ones hinder those. And so what we will say is some positive emotions are helpful and some are negative emotions are helpful. Some negative emotions are helpful and some negative emotions are unhelpful. So there are different combinations, but just don't think that because they're positive, they feel good that they're helpful. That's what the client wants, but that's not helpful. We will help them better navigate the world is if they can have some negative emotions that they're very good about carrying through on their goals in the presence of those negative emotions. Those are helpful negative emotions. But then there are unhelpful emotions that tend to get in the way. What? Deep depression, high anxiety, being enraged a good amount of the time. And remember, for all of these emotions and behaviors, we always look at three things. I add a fourth. We always look at the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of the emotion. And I add a fourth factor. Do they help or hinder the attainment of your desired life goal? Okay. So that slide you probably need to think about for a while, but it'll come easily. At first, it doesn't sound right, but as you think about it, it becomes clear. Now, I'm going to talk about in REBT, we have this vocabulary for helpful and unhelpful negative emotions. These are only negative emotions. I'm not going to talk about positive emotions because most clients don't come in and want to work to change their positive emotions. I would think they would need therapy just for wanting that as their goal. But this is an ideal vocabulary. The only reason why we have an ideal vocabulary is to help clients be on the same page. But clients are under no obligation to embrace this. And if they don't, it just makes our job a little more challenging. But you know what? One thing I want to say before we even look at these emotions: never, ever, ever react to the label of the emotion that the client gives. The label that the client gives to an emotion. Because it's not the label that matters, it's the reality. And what we want to know is when they experience that emotion, does it help them or hurt them in attaining desired life goals? Okay. So, whatever label they give it, you have to determine whether in their life, when they have that emotion, is it helping them or hindering them in the attainment of life goals? But we try to be on the same page. I try it. If the clients don't do it, fine. They're the boss. So we'll do that. Unhelpful ones that we tend to use are anxiety, depression, guilt, rage, hurt, shame. The most complicated of those is hurt, because hurt can either go to depression or anger, rage, or both. So hurt's a little more challenging when we're working with a client. The rest, rage or really a lot of anger, can be challenging, but only because the individual with anger tends to focus on the wrong thing. They tend to focus on being justified in their anger rather than is the anger helpful. Okay? The rest of them pretty straightforward. And then there's corollary one. So the corollary helpful emotion to anxiety is concern, depression, sadness, guilt, remorse, rage, annoyance, righteous indignation, hurt, disappointment, shame, regret. And it's not, and this is not a quantitative difference. It's not like if we dial anxiety down, we have concern. If we dial depression down, we have sadness. They are qualitatively different. The qualitative difference is the unhelpful one sabotages the attainment of the desired life goal, whereas the helpful one helps to attain that. How do we know? We ask the client whether it's helping or not. Okay? I hope that makes that easier. And again, this is an ideal vocabulary. We do not require that from our clients. That would be dictatorial. So in the previous slide, we learned about that ideal vocabulary. And I'm just reiterating here that clients will use whatever label they typically use, right? I've dealt with a lot of people when they come in, if they've learned that it is shameful for them to experience anger, they won't say they're angry. They'll just say they're frustrated. And so then I have to find out when they are experiencing what they call frustration. Does that hurt them or help them reach their goals? If it's getting in the way, in my head, I'm going, oh, it's anger. But I'll use whatever word they use. Okay? Just be consistent. Just be consistent on that. Next thing. Once we have the ABC and we want to change, we want to find out what the goal is of the client. And I'll spend some more time another week looking at this. And we collaborate with the client. We don't set up the goals. We collaborate with the client. If you remember common factors model, collaboration is tremendously important. We get better outcomes in therapy if we collaborate with the client than just set down the law of what the therapy is going to be like. Collaboration and working with them is wonderful and helpful for both of us, the client and the therapist. So we could have a goal about their emotion. We could have a goal about their behavior, any number of things. So we want SMART goals, and you've probably experienced SMART goals. In REBT, we will add to that one or two other goals. SMART goals, one, they need to be specific. Very, very specific, not vague in any way. If they say, I want to feel better, I don't know what that means. When you feel better, how would I know that you're feeling better? What would I see or what would you be doing? You see what I mean? I need to get it specific. If it's not specific, how do we know when we've attained it? we don't want to say, I'll just know. Well, I want to know too, so I can help you get there. So it needs to be measurable. That means simply it's observable and measurable. It could be I want to, let's say I'm having a lot of anger and I want to move that. And one of my initial goals is I want to move that down. If I'm angry 3 times a day, I want to move that down to twice a week. Okay. That would be a measurable goal. I'm not real fond of that goal. I would rather change that anger into another more functional emotion, but we can work with that as a way to move toward a more helpful goal. Achievable. It's got to be reasonably achieved, right? If it's too much, some people say, I want, instead of the depression I have right now, I want to have happiness. Well, that's probably not real achievable. You don't just hop from, depression to happiness. And so often we'll say, that sounds great. I love that that is a longer term goal. And what would be an emotion that would be a step toward reaching happiness? It may not be happy itself, it may not even feel real good, but it won't feel as bad as the depression. See what I'm doing? Just getting them to take a step in that direction, which would be more reasonable, because if it's not reasonable or achievable, then they may just give up hope. And so we certainly don't want to do that. And it has to be relevant. I mean, whatever the goal is, better be relevant to whatever they want to work on and change. It needs to be time bound. We don't want to have it no end. We might say within 5 weeks or within 2 weeks, or, we may have to adjust that as we're moving toward that. But having that goal is really, really important. Why? Well, actually, it's because of biochemistry. When we strive to attain a short-term goal, our body produces dopamine, and dopamine feels good, right? It's associated with the nucleus accumbens, and the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure center in the brain. So they strive to a short-term goal, dopamine goes up. And you know what dopamine does? It motivates. I call it the motivation chemical, because if we experience pleasure in the attainment or striving toward a goal, that may tend to have us feel more motivated to continue in that goal. Makes sense? Now, the next one is really important. And when I get to cover how we use REBT with addictions, I will really approach this, right? And this would be true of eating disorders and all kinds of things. And that's approach versus avoidant goals. Avoidant goals are when we're trying to stay away from something. Let's say I have a goal is I just want to stay away from people who are drinking. I want nothing to do with them. I don't want to be around them. That's an avoidant goal. Now, maybe real early in therapy, that would be okay. But that should not be a goal for the entire life, because with avoidant goals, life gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The approach goal and avoidant goals are very complicated. If you say, I want to avoid something, you have to think of all the ways you have to avoid it. An approach goal is you only have to find one way to attain it. So it's easier to attain. Avoidant goals, the work of research of Emmons, has shown in a wonderful book called Ultimate Concern, shows that avoidant goals are very common in individuals who experience depression and anxiety. It makes sense, right? Remember, the action potential for anxiety was avoidance. The action potential for depression is to withdraw. That is, all of them are moving away. And that's why I call avoidant goals moving away from goals, and approach goals moving toward goals. So it's best if we help clients develop an approach goal rather than an avoidant goal. And then our friends in acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a third wave behavioral model. It's kind of like second wave models with more mindfulness. Mindfulness is in second wave models. People draw too much of a distinction between the two. They're all pretty much the same, except it's where we put our emphasis sometimes. And they talk about dead man goals. A dead man's goal is if we say, what emotion would you like to have other than anxiety? And they went, I don't want to feel anything. Well, the best way to feel nothing is to be dead. That's a little extreme. So we will say, instead of not feeling anything, what would be an emotion? Maybe not a happy emotion, but it's kind of like what I said before, but it'll move you more towards some happiness and not the pain that you're experiencing in the life. So much of that pain right now. You see, so we're doing some psychoeducation about emotions and goals and all of those things, but we do it very normally, very naturally, without a lot of jargon and all of that. Okay. I have one other question. With depression, would you work more with behavioral goals first? I tend to start with behavioral goals. And the more depressed they are, the more I will go with behavioral goals, because one of the symptoms of the depression will be slow thinking, right? And feeling overwhelmed and overly focused on the negative. So sometimes if I can just get them to walk, and some, like for example, we have pleasure and mastery exercises that we often use, where I will say to a client who's significantly depressed, let's take a 20-minute walk every day and sequentially go through our senses. So on that walk, let's pay attention to what we see. Don't evaluate it, because with depression, there's always a negative evaluation of the environment. So, but just take it in, and then shift maybe over to hearing. Now, if they're walking out, a busy street, don't shut your eyes, but focus more on what you hear. And those what I like about this, and then sequentially go through, even to touch, like you're walking, the feel of the sock on your foot and the pressure of your foot when it lands on the sidewalk or on the grass or whatever. It's getting them out of their body, because depression and anxiety are so inwardly focused. And we want to, and that is the activation of what we call the default mode network. We want to get them out of that network into the task positive network, which is more focused outwardly, because our senses are avenues for pleasure to come into our bodies. And so I often will start, I know that's a long explanation, I often will start with some kind of pleasure and mastery exercises, using the senses, and just get the body moving, etc. Okay. But Dead Man's Goal, don't go for that. I'm not saying let's not just not want to feel anything. Okay, I know the idea. Okay, may not be able to get through all of this, but we will try, and I will resume with the rest of this in the following week. We'll just pick it up and then move on. But I want to look at some typical REBT interventions: cognitive, behavioral, and emotive. We divide them into three types. And the interventions in this webinar that I want to look at are, and probably we won't get through these. We'll get to those because we only have like less than 7 minutes left. I don't want to hold you up because you have lives. Is cognitive restructuring, really important, bread and butter for REBT. Rational role reversal, which is a godsend in helping to identify the unhelpful thinking that our clients may be experiencing. Acting as if, which was done way back in the 1900s with the famous psychologist at Harvard, and we've revived this and we use it quite frequently. And I'll tell you a story of a group of young teenagers males that I had who were on the autism spectrum, right? And I used this acting as if, and it was just wonderful with them. Rational emotive imagery, really important. And then self versus the roles of self, especially for people who beat up on themselves. They lack self-esteem, or they have abysmal self-esteem, that kind of thing. So let's get done what I can. And cognitive restructuring it has 3 parts. Identify what the unhelpful belief is, dispute the unhelpful beliefs. That doesn't mean be argumentative and rude and all of that, okay? Use your personality. If you're easygoing, do it easygoing way, but get it across and dispute the unhelpful belief, and then replace the unhelpful belief with a more adaptive, helpful one. Why are we doing this? The whole purpose of this is that the client realizes that the belief that they're holding is not helping them. By the way, if you're students in my course, you're going to be seeing a video that I did with a client, and I show cognitive restructuring that I do pretty quickly in that one. And he reacted really well to that quickly, very bright, self-aware individual. And then once we replace that unhelpful belief, because they realize it's not helpful, they won't understand why we're doing this if they don't realize how it's unhelpful. How do I do that? Again, by helping them see, by holding that belief, where do you end up emotionally? Where do you end up reaching your goals? Those kinds of things. That will help them to make that assessment. Okay. And then there are different types of disputes. And the four major categories. And I believe that when you first have a client, you probably want to go through all of these. Then you'll find out which ones tend to work better for that client, and then you can focus on those. But in the beginning, you can't a priori know that. What I've done is I put them in the order that most people experience as most helpful. So the one that most people experience as most helpful is the pragmatic or functional dispute. And this is one way that we do this, is just to ask them a question about their unhelpful belief. Let's say they believe that they're a total failure as a human. We would say, how is that helpful? How is that helpful for you to believe that you're a total failure as a human? What do you get out of believing that? See what I mean? They haven't thought about that kind of stuff. Many of us don't think about that. We just think what? That our belief is right, that it is the way it is. But if we shift them over to, what do you get out of this? Is it helpful or not helpful? Then we get them to realize, there may be another way. Empirical is, where's the evidence that this belief is true? A belief that you're a complete and utter failure. Does it help you? And is it even true? Is there any evidence that you have failed at everything that you've ever tried in life? You don't even know how to walk on the sidewalk and chew gum at the same time. See what I mean? Because this is an overgeneralization. And the friendship one, never use this with somebody who's angry, but for every other emotion, it's kind of okay. We would say to them, let's say, I'm a total failure as a human. We'd say, what would you say to a friend who held that belief? Would you say to them, and I will say, would you say to them, yeah, I've been meaning to tell you, you are such a failure. I don't know why I even have you as a friend. Why don't you just go up on the roof and jump off? And they go, no, I wouldn't do that. I go, why not? Well, it's not kind. Okay, then it's not kind for you to say that to yourself. It's not helpful. It's not helpful for you to say that to yourself, right? It's not supportive. It's not supportive of you. So then I might say, are there different laws of the universe that apply to you than everybody else? You see what I mean? Because they're really being hard on themselves. But if they're nice people generally, they're not going to be that way with someone else. And then the last one, some people find it helpful, others not so helpful. Those engineers at that party, they would love this one. This is where we say, how does it logically follow that because you hold this belief that it is true or helpful? How does that logically follow? Most people don't think in that domain, unless they're statistics profs or engineers or something like that. But you know what? Sometimes people surprise you, and that's what really works with them. So that's why I try to use all of them, a combination in the beginning, and then zero in on the ones that are helpful. I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to remember that I was on slide 23, and then I'll create a whole other slide PowerPoint presentation. I'll begin with the next one, and then we'll move into the next round of topics that I wanted to cover in the second one. I'm so sorry that that I took a little bit longer to get through some of these. Does anybody have any final questions in the 30 or 45 seconds that we have left before we get off? Oh, someone said I had training many years ago in New York City with Dr. Ellis and others as part of a Sunday series. Thanks. I love that. It's so nice to have somebody on here. Sir, I worked with him for, I was a fellow under him, and then I stayed on, as a staff psychologist, and then became the president of the Albert Ellis Institute. And so it was very near and dear to me. I stepped down a year or so ago so that some others could get in there and do it. And it made a real difference in my life to do that. I'm really, I mean, probably other models, but I really still connect with this. I will later today, on my YouTube channel, Psychotherapy Education and Training, you will be able to have access to this whole site that you can use, and if you email me, then next week I'll even put the email address on there. So if you email me, I will send you those slides. Okay. And Mahoney. I didn't, yeah, he's asking whether I knew Mahoney. I didn't know Mahoney, but wonderful things. Thank you. Thank all of you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and a great holiday on Monday, and that you really enjoy whatever you're doing. I hope you found some of this helpful. Thanks so much for being here. Bye-bye. Have a good day.